Greetings everybody. In the last video lecture we talked about the effects of light on plant growth. Today we're going to look at some of the effects of temperature on plant growth. And I think you'll find during this lecture video that we're going to be jumping around from topic to topic quite a bit because there are many different ways that the temperature in an environment in which a plant is growing can affect plant growth. Lots of different ways that can occur. So let's take a look at some of those ways. Alright, let's take a look at the general effect of temperature on plant growth. So you see a chart, and the vertical axis of this chart is showing the rate of plant growth. The horizontal axis of this chart is showing the temperature. So temperature increases as we move to the right. So if you look at the slope of this curve, we can say that generally speaking, as the temperature increases, the rate of plant growth also increases, but up to a certain point. Somewhere around 122 degrees Fahrenheit, proteins become denatured. So when we go beyond that temperature, we see that plant growth starts to drop off quite a bit. So most plants grow best between 50 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and that is a broad generalization. So let's talk a little bit more about proteins and what it means for them to become denatured. So proteins are large biomolecules consisting of one or more long chains of amino acids. Proteins perform a vast array of functions within organisms like plants, including catalyzing metabolic reactions, DNA replication, responding to stimuli, providing structure to cells and organisms, and transporting molecules from one location to another. So proteins are extremely important to plants and to all life forms on Earth. So when we reach 122 degrees Fahrenheit, proteins are denatured, which means that they break down and they can no longer function as they're supposed to. So plants seem to grow best, generally speaking, between 50 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit. So there is a process occurring in plants called respiration, and you and I respire as well. We know that photosynthesis is a food-producing reaction, so plants are able to take water and carbon dioxide, and along with sunlight, they can convert those things into a sugar called glucose. And that glucose then would be a food source. Respiration is a reaction that's occurring in plants as well. And respiration is occurring 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So I'd like to think of respiration as being a food-consuming reaction. So the sugars that are produced in photosynthesis are consumed in respiration. So what does the plant get out of respiration? Well, respiration provides a source of chemical energy that the plant can use to run its metabolism. So if you look at the chart, it's somewhat similar to the one we just saw on the previous slide. So we have the rate of respiration on the vertical axis, and we have the temperature on the horizontal axis. And as you can see, as the temperature increases, the rate of respiration also increases, but again, only up to a point. And there's that 122 degree Fahrenheit mark that you can see on the chart. And when we hit that temperature, we find or see that proteins become denatured, and the rate of respiration starts to dramatically drop off, as does the rate of plant growth in general. So we just looked at some of the general effects that temperature has on plant growth. Now let's look at some more specific effects. And we'll start out by talking about something that's referred to as diff. So diff is a concept that is used a lot in the production of plants in a greenhouse. And here is what diff is. So think of diff as being the difference. So it's shorthand for difference. Well, the difference in what? So the diff is defined as the difference in the day temperature that the greenhouse is maintained at minus the night temperature that the greenhouse is maintained at. So you have to understand that in greenhouses, as a grower, you can set a different day and night temperature, and you can set your controls to start that day temperature at a certain time and start that night temperature at a different time. So as it turns out, tomatoes grow better at a daytime temperature of 80 degrees Fahrenheit and a nighttime temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit than they do at a constant temperature of 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So let's think about this for a second. So we just said that tomatoes seem to grow better when you keep the daytime temperature at 80 degrees and then when you cool the nighttime temperature down to 68 degrees. So in this example, if we were to calculate the diff using the formula that I showed you just above, so the diff would be equal to the day temperature, which we said in this example is 80 degrees Fahrenheit, minus the night temperature, which we said was 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So 80 minus 68 is 12 degrees. So in this example, our diff is equal to 12 degrees. And in this case, it's a positive number. Okay, when nighttime temperature is lower than daytime temperature, the diff will be positive. Just like in the example we used with the tomatoes, we had a nighttime temperature that was 68 degrees and a daytime temperature that was 80 degrees. So the daytime temperature was higher than the nighttime temperature, and in that case our diff was positive. So lowering the nighttime temperature reduces the rate of respiration. So we looked at a chart just a while ago that showed how the rate of respiration is temperature dependent. So as the temperature increases, the rate of respiration also increases. And we also said at that time that respiration is a food consuming reactions. So respiration is taking the food that was made during photosynthesis and it's using that food, it's consuming that food. So when you lower the nighttime temperature, you reduce the rate of respiration, and that allows more sugars to be available for plant growth. So a positive diff tends to result in taller plants, more growth. So we just looked at a positive diff. Now let's look at a negative diff and see how that can affect plant growth. A negative diff occurs when nighttime temperature is higher than the daytime temperature. And the net result is negative diff results in plants that are shorter and more compact in their growth habit. So here's a couple pictures that illustrate how diff can affect plant growth. So in the picture on the top, we're looking at some petunias that are grown in pots, and they were grown in a greenhouse situation where you can control the daytime and nighttime temperatures. So stem elongation was minimized in the petunia on the right by exposing the plant to a negative diff. So what that means is the plant on the right was grown in a greenhouse environment where the nighttime temperature was set higher than the daytime temperature. That resulted in a negative diff, and the plant is shorter and more compact. The bottom picture shows that Easter lilies also respond to diff in greenhouses. So the diagram shows the effect of 3 different diff values on 3 Easter lilies growing in a greenhouse. So if you look at the picture in the center, that Easter lily was grown under conditions of 0 diff, which means that the daytime temperature was equal to the nighttime temperature in the greenhouse. If you look to the plant to the left of it, which is labeled plant A, that plant was grown under conditions of positive diff. So that means the daytime temperature was greater than the nighttime temperature, and the net result was a plant that was tall. And then if we look at C over on the right-hand side, that plant was grown under conditions of negative diff, which means that the nighttime temperature was greater than the daytime temperature, and the plant that resulted from that was short and compact. So you remember at the beginning of this lecture video, I said that we would be jumping around quite a bit. Well, we're jumping around. We just finished talking about diff and what that is, and now we're going to move on to another way that temperature can affect plant growth, and that is something called growing degree days, which we abbreviate as. So what exactly are growing degree days? Growing degree days are a measure of heat accumulation used by horticulturalists, gardeners, and farmers to predict plant and animal development rates, such as the date that a flower will bloom, or an insect will emerge from dormancy, or a crop will reach maturity. So the development of living organisms like plants and insects that cannot maintain a constant internal temperature. So think about that for a second. You know, you and I can maintain a constant internal temperature. So if somebody puts a thermometer in your mouth, they're going to read pretty much a constant temperature, 98.6, unless you have a fever or something like that. So, but with plants and insects and other forms of life, they cannot maintain a constant internal temperature, so they are highly dependent on the environmental temperature for their development. So degree days are used or can be used in the following ways. So we can estimate when plants will flower. We can estimate when we would harvest a particular plant, so maybe apples, for example, or maybe we're talking about a farmer who's growing corn in the Midwest. We can use degree days to help us time the application of herbicides and insecticides more precisely. We can estimate egg hatch, larvae development, and insect maturity of some of the insects that we might be thinking about controlling using insecticides. So let's talk about how degree days are calculated. There are many ways to calculate degree days, but the method that I'm going to illustrate to you is called the averaging method. And it goes as follows. So the degree days are equal to the daily maximum air temperature plus the daily minimum air temperature divided by 2 minus something called a base temperature. The base temperature for most purposes can be assumed to be 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And why are we picking 50 degrees Fahrenheit? Well, as it turns out, biologically speaking, there's just not a lot going on in plants and insects at temperatures below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So we kind of think of 50 degrees Fahrenheit as sort of being the cutoff. It's our base temperature. Let's take a look at an example. So we're looking at a day in time, and it doesn't really matter what particular day this is. It just happens to be a day where the high temperature, the maximum temperature, was 65 degrees, and the minimum temperature on that day was 40 degrees. The first step in calculating growing degree days is to take the high temperature plus the low temperature on that given day, add them together. So I have 65 was my max or high temperature, 40 was my low temperature or minimum temperature. If I take 65 plus 40, I get 105. I have to divide that by 2 because I'm taking an average, and I get 52.5 degrees. But we're not quite done yet. So now we take 52.5 degrees and we subtract our 50 degree base temperature from that. and you can see that we end up with 2.5 growing degree days that accumulated on that hypothetical day and time when these temperatures were recorded. Okay, here's another example. In this example, the high temperature was 60 degrees on this particular day, and the low temperature was 35 degrees. So again, if we take our high temperature of 60 plus our low temperature of 35, if we add those together, we get 95. We're taking an average, so we have to divide by 2, and that leaves us with 47.5. Okay, now we have to subtract our base temperature from 47.5. But look what happens. Now we have a negative number. So our answer is minus 2.5 growing degree days. So a negative number such as this one, when you record growing degree days, this would be recorded as a 0. So when recording growing degree days, you're really keeping a running count. So when do you start recording growing degree days? Well, generally speaking, you start the count on January 1st, or possibly sometime later, depending upon your location. Degree days are recorded daily. So if you're doing this yourself, then you have to record the high temperature and low temperature every day beginning on January 1st to keep a running total of growing degree days. So they are cumulative and they add up as time goes on. In fact, there are many websites that vary by region of the country that will keep track of growing degree days for you, and this is especially important to farmers and ranchers, other people that work in agriculture that need to kind of keep this running count. So a very interesting application of growing degree days is how you can time the application of certain herbicides to what's going on with other plants that are called indicator plants. So let me tell you about an example. So as it turns out, the growing degree days needed to bring forsythia, which is the plant that you see in the picture, into full bloom happened to be correlated with the amount of growing degree days needed for crabgrass seeds to begin germinating. So what did I just say? Well, what I just said is this. When you see, like if you're a homeowner and you're thinking about applying your crabgrass pre-emergent herbicide to your lawn, you know, that's always a question of, well, when do you do that to get maximum effect, okay? If you have a plant like forsythia in your yard, as it turns out, when forsythia is in full bloom, that happens to be the time when you need to start your crabgrass pre-emergent herbicide application. So many professional turfgrass managers will use this plant as an indicator plant to signal when it's time to apply that particular herbicide. Here's an important concept to keep in mind. So if you look at these two pictures, as it turns out, for apple trees to flower, for them to bloom, you have to accumulate 1,400 growing degree days. To harvest apples, you have to accumulate 2,800 growing degree days. Now, the accumulation of growing degree days happens irrespective of the calendar date. Okay, so let's think about somebody who's trying to grow apples up in Michigan, which is a colder climate, versus somebody who's trying to grow apples, let's say, in Oklahoma, for example. So the Michigan grower, they're going to reach 1,400 degree days at a later calendar date than the grower in Oklahoma, because Michigan is just a colder climate, and it's going to take more time to accumulate those growing degree days than it would if you were a grower in Oklahoma. Let's talk about Japanese beetles for a second. So if you could take a look at the picture that's in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, this shows you the life cycle of Japanese beetle. So the adult female beetles will lay their eggs sometime in late June into July, and those eggs will hatch and become what are called larvae, and those larvae will go through different stages of development, and they kind of remain in the soil. In fact, the larvae are what we commonly call grubs in the soil. So sometime around, let's say late April into May, the larvae begins to pupate. So it forms a pupa, and then sometime around June, the end of June, the adult beetle will emerge from that pupal case, and the beetle will come up out of the soil and then start to fly around and feed, and then it will find another female adult and mate. The females will lay eggs and the cycle repeats itself. Okay, up in the upper left-hand portion, you're looking at a map of the state of Iowa that's showing when different growing degree days were reached. So they kept track of growing degree days from January 1st through June 12th, and this was back in 2014. And they discovered that it took 1,030 growing degree days to accumulate before the adult beetles emerged from the soil. Now, when you reach 1,030 growing degree days depends on where you are in the state of Iowa. So if you're way down in the southwest corner of the state, you're going to reach, you're going to be the first part of the state to reach 1,030 growing degree days. But if you're way up in northern Iowa in that particular year, they had only accumulated somewhere around 650 growing degree days by June 12th. So the first place in Iowa that these adult beetles are going to emerge is going to be in the southwest corner of the state. So this is important for people that are in agriculture. It's good to know when the adult beetles are going to come up out of the ground and start feeding, because it gives growers a chance to prepare and get ready for the onslaught of beetles so that they can get control measures in place. I want to talk briefly about how temperature affects the sugar-starch conversion process in plants. So we had talked about starches earlier in class, and we said that starches are composed of glucose molecules that are hooked together end to end to form very long chains of molecules. So you can see the starch molecule illustrated in the picture, and it is a very large molecule consisting of thousands upon thousands of individual glucose molecules that are all linked together to one another. Temperature has an effect on the sugar-starch conversions in plants. So imagine a plant that's growing outside on a warm, sunny day. So it's daylight, the sun is out, and the plant is photosynthesizing. It's making sugars. Some of those sugars are going to be needed to maintain its metabolism immediately. Some of the sugars are not going to be needed, so they're going to be converted into starches right off the bat. So starches are a storage form of sugar. So this conversion of sugars into starches is going to occur during warm temperatures, like during the daytime. Now, when the sun sets and it's nighttime, or when it's cloudy, for example, the plant is not able to photosynthesize as much because there's just no light available. So what's going to happen is, imagine the plant during the nighttime now, in this example. The temperatures are generally cooler at night than they are during the day, and the starches that were stored during the daytime are now being reconverted back into sugars so they can be used to maintain the plant's metabolism. So let's see how this translates into the production of a few example crops. So if we're thinking of asparagus, they say the best time to harvest asparagus is in the early spring, and that's because the cooler temperatures that occur during the springtime are going to result in a higher sugar content because there's going to be a conversion from starch back to sugar in the asparagus plants. If we're talking about Brussels sprouts, those are planted in the summer for a late fall harvest. The cooler fall temperatures produce sweeter Brussels sprouts again because the starches are being reconverted back into sugars under the cooler temperatures that occur during the fall, so you end up with a sweeter Brussels sprout and therefore a better quality product. Another example of this phenomenon from the world of potted flowering plants that are grown in greenhouses is the poinsettia. So the red colored bracts that you see on the poinsettia plant pictured on the right contain the pigment called anthocyanin. Sugars are required to synthesize this pigment. So it's common practice in greenhouses to reduce the greenhouse temperature near the end of the development of the plant, therefore favoring the formation of sugars over starches, just as the bracts are beginning to color. So this is what's referred to as the industry as finishing the plant. So for this particular crop, it's common, acceptable practice to lower the greenhouse temperature near the final stages of development. So what that is going to do is it's going to cause the conversion of starches into sugars, sugar-colored pigment called anthocyanin. And when you lower the temperature, you have a lot of sugar that's available within the plant, so you can make a lot of this red-colored pigment, and you end up with a better quality product. Moving on to yet another way that temperature can affect plant growth, let's talk a little bit about seeds and soil temperature. As it turns out, soil temperature has a big effect on seed germination. So remember earlier in the class we talked about 3 factors that all seeds required for germination. 1 was the proper temperature, 2 was moisture, and 3 was the availability of oxygen or good aeration. So those 3 things are required of all seeds for germination. Now in addition to that, some seeds also require light for germination. So temperature has a big effect on seed germination. For example, corn seeds require a soil temperature of 50 degrees Fahrenheit to germinate. Soybeans, on the other hand, require a slightly warmer soil temperature of 54 degrees Fahrenheit to germinate. So the bottom line is for corn or soybean farmers, they're going to hold off and wait until the soil temperature warms up enough before they plant. Farmers have an enormous investment in seed that they have to buy every year, and they don't want to plant that seed too early and have it sit in wet, cold soil where it could possibly start to rot. And there's a group of pathogenic fungi that cause a disease called damping off. Damping off is a disease of seeds and young seedlings. And if a seed sits in cold, wet soil, then it's much more likely that it's going to rot due to damping off. This chart indicates the minimum and maximum germination temperatures for different vegetable crops that you would plant outdoors in a garden. The location of the black dot indicates the optimum or ideal germination temperature. The green dot is the realistic soil temperature that is recommended to ensure good germination in the garden. For practical purposes, you can start planting as soon as the soil reaches this temperature. So let's look at a couple different examples. So if we go to the very top line of the chart where it says beets, we can see that we can start planting beets when the soil temperature in our garden reaches 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and that the optimum germination temperature for beets is 85 degrees Fahrenheit. So one thing you have to remember about seeds that you sow outdoors in gardens is the seed will not all germinate at the same time. The seed will slowly begin to germinate over time. So you're not going to get a lot of seeds germinating at temperatures of maybe 50 or 55, but when you start getting warmer and warmer temperatures, more of those beet seeds will finally germinate. So let's compare that with, for example, watermelon. So if you look at watermelon on the chart, you can see right off the bat that watermelon is a crop that needs to be planted when the temperatures are warmer, where beets are a crop that can be planted when the temperatures are still relatively cool outdoors. So if we look at watermelon, the chart is telling us that we can start planting watermelon seeds when the soil temperature in our garden reaches about 72 degrees Fahrenheit, and that the optimum temperature for the germination of watermelon seeds is as high as 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So the moral of the story is you need to know what your soil temperature is in order to know what seeds should be sown first and what seeds should be held in reserve for a later date. This slide shows a greenhouse bench with something called bottom heat. And bottom heat is a great thing to have in a greenhouse. So if you look at the top of the bench, under the bench you can see that there's kind of a series of finned tubes that run the length of the bench, and there is hot water that is being pumped and circulated through these tubes. So this tube is really kind of like a radiator, so the fins help dissipate the heat, and it creates warm medium temperatures which speed up seed germination and also speed up the rooting process if you were sticking cuttings, for example. Shifting gears again, another effect of temperature on plants is vernalization. Vernalization is the effect of low temperatures on flower induction in plants. In plants, the vernalization stimulus is the cold temperature which is perceived by the apical meristem in a plant. And the cold temperature stimulus induces the apical meristem to change into a floral meristem and eventually into flowers. A few examples of plants that require vernalization. So the winter varieties of rye, wheat, and other cereal grains, and many biennial species including cabbage, kale, Brussels sprouts, carrots, celery, and foxglove. So let's take a look at some pictures and a few examples. Okay, this is a crop that's called winter wheat. So winter wheat is grown in the northern states across the United States, and the plant is typically planted in October. That's when the seeds would be put into the ground. The seeds will germinate because the soil temperatures in October will still be warm enough to allow seed germination to occur. So the little seedlings are going to germinate and they're going to grow just a little bit, and then winter is going to come. So November, December, You know, those plants are just sitting out there. They're small little seedlings exposed to the cold weather. They're getting vernalized by Mother Nature. So the apical meristems in those wheat plants are receiving that cold temperature signal, that stimulus that is provided by Mother Nature. Okay, after winter is over and we move into spring, the winter wheat will resume growth, begin to grow again. And then it will eventually flower. So what you're looking at in this picture is a close-up of winter wheat flowers, and you can see the stamens hanging out of the little florets. That's what a flower is called. So in wheat, the flowers are arranged in a spike, and each individual flower is referred to as being a floret. And you can see the stamens kind of hanging out of the florets. Okay, finally, by sometime in July, the winter wheat is ready to harvest. So you're not going to get any seeds, you're not going to get any grain until you produce flowers, and you're not going to get any flowers on your winter wheat until the plants have been vernalized. So that cold temperature treatment is extremely important if you want a crop that you can harvest in July. I mentioned a bit ago that there are many biennial vegetable crops that require vernalization to flower. So let's take a look at two examples. We'll start with cabbage. Now bear in mind what a biennial plant is. We defined this earlier in class, but just to refresh your memory, if you start a biennial plant from seed, and if you planted that seed in the spring, the seed would germinate and vegetative growth would occur. The plant would develop leaves and stems, but the plant will not flower in that first year of growth. After the first year of growth, the plant goes dormant, and it survives underground until the following spring. So in the spring of the second year, vegetative growth will resume, and then the plant will flower in its second year. And then after flowering comes fruit production. Fruit contains seed, and then at the end of the second year, the plant is genetically programmed to die. It's done after 2 years. So this is a picture of Napa cabbage that's bolting. So in other words, the plant that you're looking at is in its second year of growth. Now normally we don't let cabbage grow into its second year of growth because we harvest the plant after its first year of growth, so we rarely see the flowers. But this happens to be a picture of what would happen if you left the cabbage in the ground. In the second year, it would go ahead and flower. And on cabbage, we call that bolting, where it produces a strong, upright growing shoot that bears flowers. That's called bolting. And here is the same exact thing with carrots. You know, normally we harvest carrots at the end of the first year, so we normally wouldn't ever see them flower, but if you left them in the ground, they would flower in their second growing season, like you see pictured here. Moving on to another subject, the effect of temperature on dormancy. So right now, if you look around you, it's spring. Trees and shrubs all over North Texas are just beginning to leaf out, to push out new growth. And that growth is going to continue through the summer into the fall. But at some point, woody plants understand that winter is coming, dormancy is coming, and that in order to survive, the plants have to form new buds and they have to become dormant. So buds are considered dormant when they will not grow even though favorable conditions for growth exist. So dormancy is a way to protect the plant. So what would happen to a plant if it came out of dormancy during a January thaw and started growing again? Well, that would be disastrous for plants, right? If you had a tree, for example, and it went dormant sometime in November, early December, and then all of a sudden in January there was a long period of warm weather and the tree started to leaf out. Well, all that new growth will most likely be killed by freezing temperatures that are going to occur at some point in the future. So dormancy protects a plant from leafing out at the wrong time. And we also know that dormancy protects seeds. Seeds also have dormancy mechanisms, and many seeds, although they're ripe in the fall, won't germinate until the following spring. We know that plants become dormant to survive periods of adverse environmental conditions. And the biggest period that a plant has to be able to survive is just simply winter. A plant has to get through the winter, so it has to go or become dormant before winter. So what things trigger dormancy? What things cause plants to become dormant? The two main triggers are the photoperiod and low temperatures. Photoperiod we discussed earlier. We said that the photoperiod was the amount of light that a plant received in a 24-hour day. And as the photoperiod becomes shorter, as the seasons migrate from fall into winter, the plant can sense that. Specifically, the phytochrome system in plants can sense that, along with the lower temperatures that are occurring as we move from summer into fall into winter. So photoperiod and low temperatures are two things that trigger dormancy in plants. Dormancy can be accelerated by certain conditions such as dry soil conditions or low levels of nitrogen in the soil. So in other words, plants will become dormant sooner if these conditions also exist in the environment. Dormancy in plants is overcome by exposure to chilling temperatures somewhere in the range of 32 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit that plants typically experience during the winter. And photoperiod also plays a role in overcoming dormancy. So in other words, as the days begin to get longer, as the photoperiod starts to increase, that will be a trigger that will tell plants it's time to come out of their dormancy, providing that they've been exposed to the correct number of chilling hours or chilling temperatures that they need to also overcome their dormancy. One mistake that many homeowners make is to prune their trees and shrubs too late in the summer or fall. Because what can happen then is if you prune in late summer or fall, you may stimulate the plant to put out another flush of growth, and that flush of growth will not harden off or become dormant properly before the cold weather arrives, and it can be damaged by cold temperatures. Another important point to remember when managing our landscapes, our yards, is to avoid fertilizing in late summer, early fall, especially with nitrogen. So applications of nitrogen in late summer and fall will delay dormancy and stimulate soft, succulent new growth, which can also be damaged by cold temperatures. So avoid late pruning and avoid late applications of fertilizer, especially fertilizers containing nitrogen. Many fruit trees require a certain number of hours, a certain minimum number of hours between 32 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit before they are able to flower and bear fruit. Some southern states like Texas, for example, do not consistently receive enough chilling winter temperatures to meet the dormancy requirements of many fruit trees. So let's take a look at this map and see if we can understand it. So the southern United States is kind of broken up into various zones where the chilling hours have been recorded. So if you look at the red color, for example, so anywhere in red, we're saying that that area in red gets somewhere between 400 to 600 hours of temperature between 32 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit. If you move up to the yellow color, we're saying that anywhere in that area, plants growing there would receive somewhere between 6 to 800 hours between 32 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So we call those chilling hours. So if we move up into the green, plants growing in the green area get somewhere between 800 to 1,000 chilling hours. And again, the chilling hour is defined as an hour where the temperature is between 32 degrees to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So as you move, further north, those areas receive more chilling areas than the areas that are further south. All right, let's zoom in on the state of Texas and look at chilling hours in the state of Texas. So the state is divided up into different zones of chilling hours. And if you look for the Dallas-Fort Worth area, it looks like to me that we are in the 800-hour zone. So that means that fruit trees growing in the Dallas-Fort Worth area can expect to receive, on average, about 800 hours where the temperatures would be between 32 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. All right, so things can happen if you select fruit trees that have either lower or higher chilling requirements than the zone where you want to grow that fruit tree. So for example, let's say again we're in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, so we're in an area that has 800 hours, 800 chilling hours. So if we chose, for example, a peach tree that has a chilling requirement that's lower than that, so let's say we choose a peach tree that has a requirement of 600 hours. And you may ask, well, how do you even know what the chilling requirement of different fruit trees is? Well, it's going to be marked on the label when you go to the garden center to buy that fruit tree. It'll tell you how many chilling hours are needed to produce flowers and eventually fruit. So getting back to the example, if we chose a variety of peaches that has a chilling requirement that is lower than the zone that we want to plant the tree in. So let's say that we pick out a peach that only requires 600 hours, chilling hours, and we're in an 800 zone. So if I plant a 600 chilling hour peach in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, there is a greater probability that it's going to bloom early and that the blooms might be damaged by future frosts and cold weather. So that's not a good thing, because if the blooms are damaged, if we lose those flowers, then we'll never be able to make any fruit. So that's bad. On the other hand, if the chilling requirement is too high, so for example, we decide that we pick a peach that has a 1,200-hour chilling requirement and we're in a zone that only provides 800 hours. Well, what's going to happen in that scenario is the peaches may be very slow to break dormancy. So they may never get enough chilling hours to flower and make good fruit. So you have to pick fruit trees that have the correct chilling requirement for your specific area. Another relationship between temperature and plant growth relates to the germination of seeds. And there are some seeds that have a certain kind of dormancy that needs to be treated with a moist chilling treatment that's required to overcome that particular dormancy. So there are many species of woody plants, including eastern redbud and persimmon, that have this type of dormancy. So let's talk about this for a second. So let's say that you have an eastern redbud tree that's growing maybe out in your yard, or imagine an eastern redbud tree that's growing out in a field someplace. Okay, so that a particular tree is going to begin growth in the spring when the temperatures warm up and the days get longer. And then eventually it's going to flower and it's going to produce a fruit that contains seeds. And the fruit is going to fall on the ground. The pod will eventually split open and the seeds are going to be released. Now, it would be detrimental to the plant if those seeds germinated in the fall, because what's going to happen is winter will most likely kill all of those young seedlings, and that'll be the end of it. So plants have these dormancy mechanisms that protect their seeds from germinating at the wrong season. Now, if you wanted to grow eastern redbud like in a seed bed that you created in your backyard, and maybe you purchased the seed from a vendor, then in order to get that seed to germinate, you would have to stratify the seed. And this could be accomplished by taking some type of a moist medium. You could probably just use potting medium right out of the bag. You get it slightly damp. You don't want it too wet, because if it's too wet, it's going to rot the seeds. And you put some of this slightly damp potting medium into a Ziploc baggie, and then you add your redbud seeds to that mix, and you kind of mix it all together with your hand, and then you seal that baggie and put it in a refrigerator. So the refrigerator is going to kind of simulate winter, all right, and it probably is going to have to stay in that refrigerator for about 2 or 3 months. And then at that time, you can take those seeds out and you can plant them either outdoors or indoors, and they will germinate. If you didn't do the treatment, you would have very low germination. So in nature, winter is what accomplishes the seed stratification, but if you're sowing seeds in pots or doing it in a prepared seed bed, then you have to provide the stratification. And you can do that by using damp medium in a Ziploc bag and mixing the seeds into that medium. Okay, temperatures both high and low can injure plants. Let's take a look at some of the temperature-related plant injuries. One temperature-related injury to trees is called southwest side injury. This commonly occurs on trees, usually when they're younger, or on trees that typically have thin bark. And it's a problem that occurs during the winter, on bright, sunny winter days when the air temperatures are cold. So the sun starts to warm up the trunk of the tree on the south and southwest side. And as that happens, this raises the bark temperature above freezing and causes some of those cells under the bark to become active. So they're becoming active because of the warm temperatures of the sun that's shining on the south and southwest side of the trunk of the tree. Now, the problem is, at some point the sun is going to set, or maybe it gets cloudy and clouds come in and obscure the sun. Because the air temperature is very cold, those cells are going to freeze, and that's going to cause damage to the trunk of the tree. And that damage usually manifests itself as this kind of large canker looking area on the trunk of the tree, especially on the south and southwest side. Frost cracking is a problem similar to southwest side injury in that they both occur during the winter time, and they're both responses to cold temperatures. So if you think about a tree has to have a way to protect itself from freezing temperatures. And what happens is water will move out of the cells of a tree, and it'll move into the intercellular spaces between cells. And if the water freezes there, that's okay, because at least the water is out of the cell. Because what would happen is if water were to freeze inside of plant cells, it would cause those cells to burst or break, and of course that will, kill the cell. So that's not good. So we have to move water into the intracellular spaces between cells, and let it freeze there. Well, what happens during the winter is as the trunk starts to warm up on sunny days where the air temperatures are very cold, water can begin to move back into the cells. Okay, and then if the sun sets, the temperature can change very quickly before the plant can adjust. And what will happen is those cells will water in those cells will freeze, and that will kill the cell. Frost cracking can sometimes actually be heard. Sometimes it's accompanied by a loud audible popping sound that occurs when the tree trunks crack. Now, as we move from winter into spring, sometimes those cracks can kind of close together, and the plant can try to heal that wound over. But frost cracking is something that can really happen even in the south, even in Texas on species that are kind of susceptible to it. For example, I just had a fig tree that was growing in my yard that I lost because of frost cracking. Chilling injury to either whole plants or parts of a plant results in limp, water-soaked appearing leaves and stems that will eventually turn brown in color. So this is a cucumber seedling. So the seed had germinated, made a seedling, and then the seedling was exposed to, sub-freezing temperatures, and that is basically going to kill the cell because the water inside the cells freeze, and as the water freezes, it expands, and that ruptures the cell, and then all those tissues die. And a plant that has just received chilling injury will have a limped, kind of water-soaked look, and then eventually the leaves and stems are going to turn brown. Leaf scorch is a problem caused by high temperatures. So leaves may scorch when the rate of water absorption is not able to keep up with transpiration or water loss. So water is being absorbed by the roots under normal circumstances. Remember that trees and shrubs, plants transpire, so they lose water through their stomata, and that's necessary because that's one of the main factors that helps move water up through the xylem of the plant. Well, sometimes in plants we can reach a point where the amount of water that's absorbed by the root system is not able to keep up with the amount of water that's being lost to transpiration. And what can happen is we can kill tissue, and usually this happens on the edges or margins of the leaf. So the margin of the leaf sort of becomes brown and discolored on a leaf that is suffering from leaf scorch. Okay, sunburn is also caused by high temperatures. So sunburn is what happens to plants when you take a plant, for example, like a hosta, which is normally a plant that prefers growing in the shade. So it's not a plant that can tolerate full sun. And then if you move that plant into a sunny location or plant it in a sunny location, it can respond by producing what's called sunburn, and the leaves just kind of turn brown and dry up because that tissue is just damaged by the intense sun. This can also happen when you grow plants in a greenhouse situation, for example, and then they may have been under some shade in the greenhouse, and then you take them and transplant them outside in full sun. Sometimes the plants can't adjust to being in a shaded greenhouse environment and then moving to full sun, and they respond by sunburning. So ideally, if you take something from a shaded location and you want to transplant it to a sunny location, if you can do that during a period of cloudy weather, that's good because that'll give the plant a little bit of time to acclimate, to being outdoors, growing out in the real world. Okay, so wow, we covered a lot of stuff in this PowerPoint, lots of ways that temperature affects plant growth. Thanks for watching, everybody.